All right, so welcome. Thanks for joining us today. We are going to be discussing Brotherhood of Barristers, a cultural history of the British legal profession, 1840 to 1940, with Ren Pepitone. And Sam Rutherford is going to be joining her in conversation. I'm just going to briefly introduce our guests, and then I'm going to turn it over to them to start the conversation. So Ren Pepitone is an assistant professor of history at New York University. Their book, Brotherhood of Barristers, was published with Cambridge University Press in April 2024. Support for this work came from the NACBS, Paul Mellon Center for Studies in British Art, the Doris G. Quinn Foundation, and the University of Cambridge. They are currently researching a project on amateur theater in Great Britain across the 20th century. And Sam Rutherford is lecturer in LGBTQ+ history and the history of sexuality at the University of Glasgow. His book, Teaching Gender, The British University and the Rise of Heterosexuality, 1860 to 1939, will be published by Oxford University Press in April 2025. And maybe we can hear more about that next year, maybe, if we're lucky. Okay, so I will turn it over to you all to get started.
Great, thank you so much, Amanda. So Sam, if it's okay with you, I was just gonna maybe speak very briefly about a brief overview of the key contentions of the book, but also introduce folks to the Inns of Court as institutions, because they're central to my work, but they're not necessarily something that everyone will have encountered before. So for those who haven't, the British legal profession prior to the late 20th and in actually early 21st century, well, it has been a split legal profession in which there's a difference between barristers and solicitors. So solicitors interacted with clients. Barristers held the sole right to plead at the bar. And in order to become a barrister, a person had to join one of 4 legal societies that had buildings and grounds in central London. These 4 collectively were known as the Inns of Court. And particularly because I know we have at least some of the folks here that are coming from the US context, there's not a very good American corollary. So, I mean, we're British studies folks, so it might seem less odd. But in this case, these are guild-like professional associations. They're not law schools. They're places where men, and for the first 500 years of their existence, only men would go to keep term by dining a certain number of times in hall. And then after they had done so for the requisite amount of time, regardless of whether or not they had taken in any kind of legal learning, which was completely optional, they could be called to the bar and allowed to practice as barristers. And so those are the institutions that I'm looking at in the context of my project, because there are many different branches of law that barristers might practice if they chose to practice at all. But the one sort of universal experience that every barrister would have had would be being a member of the Inns and spending time at the Inns of Court. Also, I mentioned that these institutions were and still are in central London. And that also becomes quite important to the story that I'm telling. If you can imagine, they're kind of nestled where Fleet Street meets the Strand, just north of the Thames, and then up along Holborn. So they're kind of right on the edge of the city of London, in one of the oldest parts of the capital. The story that I'm telling in this book is a story about continuity over time, and particularly the way that fairly conservative institutions maintain their authority in the face of a variety of changes. So the chronology goes from roughly 1840 to 1940. And in that course of time, I'm looking at the forces of liberalism and reform, processes of rationalization, which if we think about Parliament and the army and other kinds of institutions that underwent meritocratic reforms in the 19th century, the Inns more or less buck this trend and remain quite anomalous and archaic institutions in terms of their working. I then look at the way that a variety of racial and political and ethnic figures put pressure on the culture of the societies. after having first established what that culture is, I should say. So I think about the ways that ideas of gentlemanliness, and particularly historicism and in the inn's ancient lineage, um, created a particular ideal of the gentlemanly professional um, at mid-century, and kind of look at ways in which that was then ingrained and passed on to new members of the profession. And then in the second half of the book, I look at ways in which figures like pacifists, communists, and Indian nationalists challenged that idea and whether or not the societies could accommodate them into membership of the bar. And then the book culminates by looking at the introduction of women to the profession, which happened in 1919 because of an act of parliament, which forced these societies to open themselves to women. So that's a very broad overview, but for now, I'll kind of leave it there because I think as Sam and I kind of talk back and forth, we'll end up hitting on other aspects of the text.
Great, thanks, Ren. And I feel like someone should wave the book around since this is a book of it. So here it is. That's what it looks like. You know, I think one of the exciting things about it is how it kind of combines this sort of broad overview narrative story that Ren has just delineated with a lot of like really rich, thick detail. And, you know, I think one of the interesting things about it is the relationship between that just like really fine-grained detail about how these idiosyncratic institutions work and the bigger story. And I mean, maybe I want to get on to asking about some of the kind of historiographical interventions and some of these concepts like liberalism, but maybe you could start by telling us a bit more about how you came to the idea of the project, which I think was your dissertation originally.
Yes,
right?
yeah. So it's born out of my dissertation, and then the like earliest seeds go back even further. So I see that Lydia Murdoch is here. I worked with her while I was at Vassar as an undergraduate. And wrote a senior thesis there where I was looking at a case study of Arthur Mumby and Hannah Colwick, who I'm sure we've encountered in various forums. And so when I went to grad school, you know, one of the takeaways that I had from doing that undergraduate work was that prior to that, I had kind of known that I was interested in gender history, but really thought I was more of like a women's historian. And coming out of that, I was thinking a lot more about masculinity, and was really interested in kind of middle class or elite male social networks. And so I started thinking about where Mumby was living and what kind of social networks he had, which brought me to the Inns of Court, which were institutions I hadn't encountered prior to that. But as I began to try to understand what these institutions were and what was happening there, both at mid-century and later, I started to discover all of these curiosities, right? So in the mid-19th century, there's a population of confirmed bachelors and literati that are living in these legal spaces that I thought, like, you know, that's quite curious. Why are they there? Why are these kind of authors and artists hanging out here? And then as I understood the function of the societies in relationship to other forms of professional training across the 20th century, I also thought it was quite strange that they seem to endure and weather change in ways that you don't necessarily see in other institutions. And so that kind of combination of question of the social aspect of what was happening there and the complicated social relationships of the men at these institutions was kind of one entry point. And then thinking about the institutions over time was the other. I was also particularly struck by the fact that not very much work has been done on the modern legal profession compared to the early modern. There's a much more robust historiography on the inns in the early modern period because of the function they served as kind of finishing schools for gentlemen and places where there was like a lot of theater and mooting and kind of they were considered rich cultural centers. There's only a handful of studies that look at them in the modern period. And within those, there was almost no attention to things like gender, a little bit of attention to race, and certainly no attention to geography and the society's role in the center of London, beyond the fact that, of course, that a lot of legal life took place in London. So those were all kind of entry points to the project.
So, and then you wrote a dissertation, and then you turned it into a book. And I think, as somebody kind of at a similar career stage, I'm always fascinated and perhaps instructive for grad students who are in the audience, like, what changed between the dissertation and the book, and how did that relate to kind of your intellectual trajectory and your professional trajectory?
Absolutely. So I think one of the first changes was that um, I was just broadening my scope both chronologically and then also in terms of, for the dissertation, I had looked at two of these four institutions for mostly time reasons. And once I expanded out to all of the Inns of Court, all four of them, that also opened up new source material. So, for example, the final chapter of the book uses two case studies. One of Helena Normanton, who was a liberal feminist who campaigned to open the bar and then trained as a barrister, and the other is Cornelia Siraji, who's an Indian woman who is quite conservative in her politics, but who went to Oxford and then, a couple of decades later, was at the Inns of Court training to become a barrister as well. And so the dissertation had just Normanton in its final chapter, and it was telling I think it's still a complex story, but not to the same degree. I also ended up reorganizing the first two chapters. I was having a hard time figuring out how to kind of discuss the inns in relationship to the city and to popular culture and tourism, and then the kind of on the ground masculine culture of the law students and barristers there, in part because that on the ground culture is really bound up in being located in central London, and also particularly in the late 19th and early 20th century, is very much looking back to a lot of the cultural and literary production around the inns in the mid-Victorian period. And so kind of figuring out how to tell all of the pieces of that in ways that created coherent chapters and coherent arguments was something I don't feel like I'd figured out how to do until I got feedback from my reviewers. And that actually, while something I'd been nervous about since this was a first book, was also really, really helpful for thinking through and kind of seeing things I hadn't seen and getting outside eyes. So that those were all kinds of, I ended up cutting apart what had been chapters in the dissertation and reforming them into something new, and in ways also that there's very much an argument about class that I'm making as well, and the rise of the middle class, and in the ways that that's kind of the first major demographic change that these societies are having to respond to. Kind of all of the changes that follow, in some ways they're approaching with a framework that they've put in place because of the increasing availability of the middle classes to train at the inns. And that was something that was a thread that had been there in the dissertation, but it was much more muted. And I think, cutting things apart and reframing them allowed me to be much more emphatic about that point.
That's super interesting. Yeah. And I think a lot of us have that experience of figuring out what we're really arguing in that revision process. I definitely had that experience. And I think, yeah, all of the things that you just said are some of the things that come through most clearly, like reading the finished product now. I see that someone has already put a question in the chat. Do that, and we'll keep collecting them, and then when we open it up to a broader Q&A, Ren will be able to answer some of those questions. But I wanted to ask a bit more about kind of concepts and historiographical interventions. Maybe particularly about this category of liberalism, about which I think one of the things that interested me about like the first half of the book that kind of sets up this regime of Victorian liberalism that then gets challenged, right, is that there's kind of an older, very well-established historiography about what Victorian liberalism is. But then you bring this spatial element to that and this kind of local government element to it, which I think is really interesting. So I wonder if you could sort of say a bit more about how you understand that category and what the book tells us about how liberalism worked.
Sure, absolutely. So I think this was the part of my argument that I struggled with the most and for the longest time, because I certainly, in my graduate training, I had read Patrick Joy's Rule of Freedom and was very much thinking about liberalism and Foucauldian governmentality and the workings of the city in ways that, to me, made a lot of sense to parts of what I saw in my primary sources and thinking about these institutions. But then there's this kind of older historiography about liberalism in terms of, again, these kind of arguments about rationalization and things like that, which felt very out of keeping with the story I was telling. And I was also kind of struggling of, there are so many different operating conceptions of what liberalism is and conservatism. And here I have these change resistant institutions that seem deeply conservative by like lowercase c definitions of conservatism, but that are also very much engaged with processes of liberalism happening around them, and they're often resisting those processes, but not always. And they're also quite adept at kind of selectively opting in to which aspects of liberal reform they seem to understand as suiting their needs. And so it took, I think, a long time for me to figure out how to talk about what I saw happening. But ultimately, the argument that I'm making is that if we're thinking about liberalism as, again, in that more Foucauldian model of governmentality and of the kind of processes of the city, that all different kinds of institutions, including conservative institutions, I mean, had no choice but to engage with those processes, and sometimes could embrace and benefit from them. So one of the chapters, the first one in the book, looks at the ways that these societies were navigating the building of the Victoria Embankment, which for the temples kind of it disrupted their access to the river, but then also gave them they got a bunch of land out of the deal that they eventually struck with the Metropolitan Board of Works. And also we're happy to kind of offset certain kinds of things like costs for policing and things like that they previously been doing for themselves, and kind of allowed the city to come in. And so on the one hand, liberalism is functioning in that, again, the institutional level in this work, which is one aspect of the way that I'm kind of approaching it, my analysis. But then I'm also trying to think, about the smaller kind of embodied experience within the city and within an institution, and the ways that things like the idea of the gentlemanly liberal subject was in operation, and kind of became part and parcel of the gentlemanly professional that was imagined to be the barrister, and the forms of self-regulation requisite for that, which became particularly important in the case of colonial students and debates over whether overseas students, particularly from India, could or should be called to train at the bar. And so you also have a variety of kind of competing ideas of the liberal subject that get expressed in the testimony of various professionals. So the benchers are the kind of upper echelons of the societies that kind of act as trustees, and they were in conversation with bodies like the India Office, and kind of Scotland Yard and other kind of regulatory branches to discuss what it meant for students from India to come and train, and whether those students were capable of self-regulating in the ways that would be requisite for what we would understand as the liberal subject.
Yeah, can you say more about that, like, culture of gentlemanliness and how it kind of played out in day-to-day interactions?
Sure. So one of the ways that I think about the formation of the gentlemanly professional is particularly through ritual and tradition at the society. So I look a lot around dining issues, or dining rituals rather. I had mentioned that for much of the period that I'm studying, although not all, the only requirement for being called to the bar was keeping term by eating dinner in the society's halls. And that meant that dining took on quite an outside sense of importance. And now the societies kind of justify why that would be, right? And they talk about kind of passing on modes of knowledge from one generation to another, and that law students needed to kind of reinforce what they had been reading in books, but also kind of learn the ineffable, what we might even call like habitus if we were talking about Bourdieu, which I don't necessarily do, but I think that we could, from other members of the profession. And so as a response to change, these institutions revive and reemphasize rituals that may or may not have been historic. Some of them we know for sure were not, and some of them it's a little bit it's a bit more ambiguous, but either way, there's a lot of emphasis on ritual and on sociability. So there are all sorts of associated clubs and societies, ways for members of the bar to socialize with one another, whether that's kind of playing chess or lawn tennis or having the debating society, the music society, all sorts of ways in which, again, these are institutions that are producing lawyers, but legal learning is one of the kind of, I don't want to say least emphasized, but that's meant to be more self-directed, and where the institutions are actually intervening are in this kind of social aspect, for creating then that gentlemanly liberal subject. And you can see ways in which I should be clear that even white elite men are not uniformly embracing this aspect of the society's lives. So some of the sources that I'm looking at are memoirs from people who clearly loved this culture and thought it was the best thing ever, and are like deeply nostalgic if they're older for the days when they got to pal around with their friends eating dinner at the inns. But there are other members of the profession, often those who, not always, but in the case of, let's say, white members, which I'll bracket off just because I think they experienced a different kind of set of prejudices than members of color and later women. But members who maybe weren't as successful as they had hoped, or who kind of didn't fit into that culture in one way or another, pointed out ways in which it was actually kind of absurd to have to eat dinner, right? That it served no function. For overseas students, even civil servants who were trying to advance through the ranks of bureaucracy by getting a law degree, or call to the bar rather, were frustrated that they had to keep coming back to London years apart while they were on leave just to eat dinner. It didn't make sense. And then the hall, right, where these dinners are taking place, also became a site for dramas of enmity. So when barristers had conflict with one another, they might kind of play those conflicts out in the society's dining halls in ways that were like quite public, and often relying on kind of implicit ideas of masculinity and undermining those ideas to kind of shame their opponent in some way.
And I guess, I mean, I'm looking at the questions coming in the chat, which are really about the sort of professional, I mean, we can sort of speak to them more specifically later perhaps, but they're really about the kind of professional experience of like actually being a lawyer. But, I think it's worth highlighting that, this culture of the dining culture at the ends that you're talking about, right, is like not, it's so sort of distanced from the question of representing clients in court, right? That it's about absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that the book does, and this is, I'm sure I'll get pushback on this when more reviews come in, but I don't really spend a lot of time with barristers in law courts, because that's actually a much smaller fraction of the profession overall. Right? You have some barristers who would have been practicing in pleading in that way. But when people are doing things like conveyancing and patent work and other kinds of branches of law, they wouldn't have been in the law court. So again, I'm kind of focused on the inns as institutions, because they're the singular universal experience for members of the profession. And they also, I should say, and I don't know if I made this clear, that I mentioned they're what regulate being called to the bar, but they also regulate like discipline and continued practice at the bar. So the benchers of these societies basically have almost omnipotent discretion as to who gets to practice, whether that's from a call at the bar or continuing. And so I also later in the work look at various disciplinary cases where men were disbarred or removed from the role of students for a variety of reasons. And some of the illiberalism that I'm talking about in terms of the continued practice is the fact that there really are not clear rules as to the power of the benchers in these societies to disbar someone. There's not consistency in terms of the decisions that they make. That's some of what I look at in the book is, why someone, I look at 3 sedition cases, for example, in which there are really different decisions made for these 3 different men in roughly a 10-year time period who had all been convicted of sedition, but for whom their experience at the ends went in very different ways. And there's something, detractors point out like very arbitrary and fairly unchecked about the authority of these societies. And so that's where the book tends to focus, which is not to say I think there's plenty of room for work that looks at the courtroom, but that's not quite where my work is going.
Yeah. You mentioned, I think at the outset, you mentioned sort of the idea of a culture of confirmed bachelors. And, so I wanted to ask you about kind of how you're thinking about the category of homosexuality. And I was like, got really fixated in a way that I sometimes get really fixated on small things. I got really fixated on pages 70 to 71 of the book, which is where you say, you sort of narrate like, you didn't find any explicit evidence of homosexuality. That's not to say that it didn't exist, And so I guess a 2-part question, like, how are you thinking about the category of homosexuality and how we might use it to understand these spaces? And then did you go looking for homosexuality or sex between residents of the inns and then not find it? And, what was your response to that?
So taking the second question first, I think because it'll play into, why I'm using the term homosocial. Cards on the table. I mean, I wanted to find the homosex in this story, I think, about as much as anyone possibly could. That was part of what attracted me, when I was looking at the culture of confirmed bachelors that were living there mid-century. I mean, there are all of these facets that in my mind, especially as a young grad student, I was like, oh, no one really seems to work on these institutions, but they're populated by public school and Oxbridge men. They're in the center of basically right in the heart of London's sex trade in the mid-19th century. These are spaces that are largely unmonitored. I mean, where else could you imagine would be like a better spot for men to engage in various kind of sexual relationships with one another. And so I thought, I was like, I'm going to go off and I'm going to, find this untold history of homosexuality that no one has looked before. And I'm not doing that because I just did not find evidence of it. There's a lot of homoeroticism in literary fiction. And I kind of treat that as much as I can in the text. But what I realized, though, is, and part of the reason I'm using homosocial is the role of affect and kind of male friendship and ideas of kind of like, the book is Brotherhood of Barristers because this metaphor of brotherhood is tossed around a lot, right? And so that's a metaphor that implies a kinship or that members of the legal profession should feel for one another, the same kind of warmth and familiarity that they might feel for kin, or maybe negative feelings for kin as well. But that affect and emotion is really important. And I hadn't, I expected to find affect in some of the literati that were kicking around the societies in the mid Victorian period, but I hadn't really expected to find that rhetoric about affect and emotion beyond that, and integrated into the culture of the profession itself. And so I think homosocial, barring, it's not, I'm using it the way that Cedric conceptualizes it, in which case it connotes kind of a broad spectrum of feelings that are open to erotic possibility, but that don't necessarily mean that it has to be erotic, but that there is an effective kind of tie or set of relationships between the men in these institutions. And so that's kind of where I came to and what I decided to deploy as an analytic category, because I think it's kind of doing the work for me that is both kind of like precise, but also a little bit imprecise in a deliberately so.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, so far we've, in this discussion, we've built up the kind of regime of liberalism and gentlemanliness that the first half of the book develops, and I've not been using the time very effectively, because then really the whole second half of the book is about, the sort of challenges to that regime. But I was really hoping that so you mentioned that you developed this comparison between Helen Normanton and Cornelia Sorabji, and I was super interested to hear that Sorabji wasn't in the dissertation, but I really wanted to ask you to sort of say more about that comparison, because I think that case study really successfully illustrates, what the challenges, what kinds of challenges are sort of posed to this regime, and then how the bar accommodates them.
Sure. So I'd be happy to talk about it. It's that chapter it's not a departure from the rest, but it is the only chapter that relies so heavily on 2 case studies. But that's because source wise, most of the rest of the project is doing my best to kind of take small anecdotes and fragmentary evidence and weave it together into a greater whole. I didn't have the same kind of like cache of documents. But because both Sorabji and Normanton really understood themselves as important figures, they're figures who, if I may say so, have quite a bit of ego. I mean, they're not necessarily wrong either. They are important, but they understood it, and so they preserved this kind of vast archive, all of which is, or much of which was kind of dedicated to their attempts to crack into the legal profession. And so what I'm able to do is Sorabji's a bit older than Normanton, and so I can look at starting in the 1890s ways in which she was attempting to kind of claw her way into the legal profession. Although claw her way is really maybe the wrong phrase, because she is she comes from a somewhat elite Indian family. She gets scholarships. She goes to Oxford. She's then really kind of hobnobbing with the elite while she's there, and because she sees herself as singular and really wants to be singular and to practice law in India, working with Purdanashans, right? So women who were secluded and therefore wouldn't necessarily be able to have legal counsel from a man. She actually is very much embraced by a lot of the kind of elite families that she works with, and so she kind of uses, if I'm thinking about different strategies for kind of women's approach to practicing as legal professionals, particularly prior to the bar's open, Sorabji relies on networks and elite networks that she cultivates. She relies, I talk about, I use Sian Nagai and thinking about effective cuteness. Sorabji constantly diminishes herself in her writing and talks about herself as small and dumb, when of course she's so singular and doing something that's incredible, but kind of relies on those networks and that diminishment to then take a path that no one else would really be able to replicate, and she's fine with that. She doesn't really want to open a pathway for other people. Normanton is, as I mentioned earlier, she's a liberal feminist. She's very much involved in the suffrage movement in the 19-teens, and then once suffrage is successful, really turns her energies and sets her sights on opening the bar to women from a perspective of like, women need women lawyers, and her strategy is much more kind of like directly campaigning and petitioning and kind of meeting the challenges and obstacles in her way and trying to knock them down and open the door for women who come behind her. And because of that, she's met with a lot more resistance, right? Whereas Sorabji is often kind of embraced and discussed as kind of wonderful and has a lot of support. Normanton, I mean, does have a lot of support in some ways, but at the societies, once the bar is open in 1919, she's comes across as colloquially, it's kind of like a thorn in the side of the benchers of the Middle Temple to which she belongs. They are constantly monitoring her behavior. They're looking at these kind of like poorly defined legal rules and precedents that she's for behavior, right? Having nothing to do with like courtroom practice, but just like there were prohibitions against advertising. For example, barristers couldn't, take out ads for their services in the newspaper. Normanton doesn't do that, but there is an announcement of her, her marriage and keeping her maiden name, and the benchers call her to account for that. And so there are all these ways in which she is facing setbacks. And then you can also see kind of covert strategies on the part of the societies as well to navigate women in their midst. So if we're thinking about the use of space, I've emphasized the importance of dining at these societies, and the Middle Temple, where Normanton was a member, created a separate table that women would be relegated to when they had to dine at the society's hall. And so if the supposed logic of dining rituals was that newer members of the bar and law students were connecting with older members and gaining legal knowledge and knowledge of legal culture, women relegated to their own table couldn't possibly engage in those practices. And in fact, one of the times that Normanton was called to account for herself of having kind of broken legal broken rules by advertising, even though she really hadn't advertised. But one of the things she said is like, how could I possibly have known that, because I'm not allowed to engage with other members of the profession through dining. So those are some of the in looking at these two case studies, I have thoughts about the ways that gender, race, class, and politics are all kind of woven together to create quite distinct experiences for these two women at the bar.
Great, thank you. There's like so many questions coming in the chat already. Maybe one last thing from me before we open it up, which is, the book is really firmly rooted in the period before the Second World War, but obviously these institutions still exist today. And so I was wondering, whether you think we learned something kind of about the perpetuation of the British elite today from this book, and then maybe from a writing point of view, like how you thought about whether to make contemporary parallels or resonances explicit in the book.
Yeah. So I'll just a note for everyone that I stopped the book at the Second World War, in part because the societies are largely razed to the ground during the Blitz, and I, needing a stopping point somewhere because of the focus on the built environment, that seemed like a logical place to stop. But as Sam points out, right, the institutions continued. You still actually, you need a law degree to practice law now, thankfully. But you also still have to join an inn of court and keep term, eating dinners, and be called to the bar. So that hasn't gone away. I think part of what I hope that I'm setting up for, is the model thinking about kind of enduring forms of institutional culture, particularly as I was, revising this book and thinking about it. It felt like in 2017, 2018, and into even 2020, we were at this moment where it felt like we were having a cultural reckoning and really grappling with legacies of gender inequality and racism in institutions. And there was a lot of public conversation around those things. And, to me, I think that's really important, but it felt like a lot of hand wringing, or a lot of kind of, let's point to some formal policies designed to address those issues. And I'm not, again, the conversation needs to happen. The formal policies, I think, are also important. But if the reason that institutions, I don't know, kind of persist in particular cultures, right, is tied to formal policies, but there's also a lot of like informal and enduring legacies of socialization and the ways that institutions take on particular ethos and outlooks. And in that regard, what I hope I'm doing is setting up, one way of kind of tracing those enduring forms of gender and racial regimes that go beyond the realm of the formal, and that hopefully resonate for the legal profession, but also resonate beyond that to lots of institutions in Britain and hopefully in the US as well. And I think for me, you know, I know sometimes right, people have different feelings about presentism. But for me, I felt like I had to at least draw some of those connections and parallels to the current day, because I see the work that I do as a historian in terms of investigating relationships of power as one of the kind of primary interests that, you know, that I hold. And I think the reason we investigate relationships of power is to hopefully work against ones that are unequal or imbalanced. And so for me, that felt like drawing those connections kind of just it was something I kind of had to do.
Great, thanks. Should I pass it back to Amanda now to chair the Q&A? Is that what's happening?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great.
Excellent. So yes, we do have a lot of questions coming in through the chat, and some of these have already kind of been touched on. I want to turn it over to Eva, because you said that you had a longish question about professionalization. So if you want to go ahead and ask that.
Sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, that was a cheap way to jump to the head of the maybe just be like, call on me. Anyway, I'm super interested by the use of the word profession to describe what it is we're talking about here, because when you think about social scientists and how they talk about the process of professionalization, when they're trying to like abstract it from any particular profession, they'll talk a lot about how professionalization is often about raising the status of a particular group of practitioners, or responding to criticism of some kind, policing, because there's been some kind of issue about, you know, what their members are doing and it's causing a problem. Therefore, we have to professionalize. We have to create codes of conduct. We have to create a new institution to police who gets to be part of this and that sort of thing. And I'm thinking about pharmacists and or like doctors, maybe teachers, that sort of stuff. And I'm also thinking from a very American context right now, so please correct me if I'm wrong about this. But anyway, this is a different situation where the institution has existed before there's even, like, the institution existed before there's even a model of what a professional is supposed to be, I suppose. And it was doing something, you mentioned that it was doing something very different in the early modern period than a professional organization is supposed to do by the end of the Victorian period. So I guess my question is, how does your story relate to, or you know, do you touch on the relationship between the Inns of Court as an institution and barristers as a professional identity, how their self-conception is relating to changing ideas of what a profession is, what a professional is supposed to do, and what membership in these kind of communities is supposed to guarantee?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks very much for that question. You're kind of exactly right that this is a somewhat unusual model, because in fact, the Inns of Court had a lot more prestige in the early modern period and are trying to figure out how to hold on to that and kind of leverage it in the context of what professions have become in the Victorian period. Whereas doctors, for sure, but even the lower half of the bar, solicitors, they're following that other model of professionalization that you're talking about, where they didn't have as much status. And they're trying to, you know, they create the law society and regulations and things like that to try to increase their prestige. What the Inns of Court do, though, and I think this is kind of similar amongst other lines, is they have this history of prestige, and so they're still thinking about how to kind of bolster their status, particularly as, you know, Parliament is thinking about reforms of different professions. But they draw on historicist ideas. They look back to their built environment, right? And so one of the things I didn't mention is dining rituals happen in hall. Those halls either were from the Elizabethan period, like they genuinely are, or they're painstakingly constructed with a historicist mind, right? So the built environment is designed to kind of echo that lineage of prestige. There are some kind of nominal reforms that are put in place. So there's, you know, a general council of the bar that's formed, and there's optional exams or ways, you know, things that make it look like they're also following these models of rationalization and things like that, and they're not really. If you look at like how much teeth any of these things have or what they do, they're extremely surface level. But yeah, so you're absolutely right that there is a little bit of pressure from the outside as the notion of the profession kind of crystallizes in the 19th century. It's just the ways that the institutions kind of, the inns are unique, I think, because of the position they come into that with from the start.
Just a really quick clarification. So that doesn't mean there was a scandal or a problem and people were saying we have to reform the Inns of Court or anything. It's more like the inns are looking forward and being like, we have to proactively protect our prestige against,
More so the latter. There's literally a couple, one or two parliamentarians who are saying we should reform the Inns of Court. It's really weird that people who are forming our barristers and then therefore our judiciary have no standards, and they just don't get a lot of traction. No one really seems to care. And the society is kind of, you know, make a few proactive reforms, and then any even chatter in Parliament dies away. Yeah, there's just not a lot of appetite for it.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And we've got a question from Joe that says, speaking as an American attorney, I am intrigued by the complete lack of discussion of clients and justice. At any point in the time covered by your research, was there any actual training or educational exposure to how to represent a client?
Okay, so in comparison to the American system, there's a little bit of complexity there, in part because Americans wouldn't have solicitors that are directly interacting with clients in the same way that there would be in the British system. So in terms of clients, barristers are receiving briefs from solicitors. They may or may not ever be interacting with a client. It would kind of depend on the case. And also the kind of law that they're practicing. So again, it's only a fraction of barristers in the profession who would be like pleading or directly interacting with, or not directly, but even interfacing with clients. There is, as the period I studied goes on, more of an apparatus constructed for training. Again, it's often something barristers opt into, but there are like classes and lectures and things that are created because there's a recognition that like professional expertise is probably good for people to have. There's also, I should say, a glut of barristers at the mid-century because more people can afford to join these societies, and there become too many barristers, and so it becomes more and more important for them to actually be able to successfully practice their profession. But again, it's still pretty late into the 20th century, or not late into the 20th, but rather late into the period I study into the 20th century before someone could not possibly be called to the bar without any legal learning. For quite a while, it is possible to be called to the bar and really have no legal learning whatsoever.
Okay. So next question from Jeffrey Jones. So thanks for the wonderful presentation. I too am fascinated with these institutions as sites of cultural production, homosociality, and power that exist outside of the formal state. Did you come across connections in London with other organizations and societies with similar themes? So I'm thinking in particular of Masonic lodges, but there are other examples, I'm sure.
Absolutely. So there's definitely a lot of connection with Masonic lodges. I also think a lot about gentlemen's clubs. But what's interesting, right? So in clubland, there's a particular prohibition against discussion of business. And Masonic lodges, I think, were often seen as spaces that had that effective resonance, but in opposition to the kind of cold and unfeeling world of work, right? That they were spaces where there's a kind of fraternity and warmth in opposition to the like rational and unfeeling world of particularly various kinds of like finance, capital, and things like that. And so there are definitely resonances across these spaces. But what I found sort of unique to the inns was that they were drawing on those forms of socialization and warmth and affect, but within the professional space itself. And that seemed to me to stand out somewhat from other places that I'd come across. These other spaces serve a variety of functions, but they're not usually spaces of like training and practice for a profession.
So we've got a question from George that says, I have been surprised by the number of prominent men, writers, journalists, etc., who were members of the bar, but who didn't practice law.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense of the extent to which this was a choice or a result of not being able to secure legal work?
So it depends on the period that you're looking at and also kind of the individual, but it's a mixture of both. So some in the kind of 1840s, 1850s, some of the men who are living at the Inns of Court, for example, are living there because it's really cheap to do so in that moment, and they can be in central London and close to Fleet Street and the printing trade, but be in kind of like semi-derelict housing, but that's very affordable. And that's why they're there. Or someone like Dickens, for example, joins the bar because he's got kind of like familial pressure too, and then realizes that that's not going to be his path. He's going to be way more successful if he sticks to writing. But that glut of barristers that I mentioned, right? There's more men that could practice than there's work to go around, and so that connection to Fleet Street becomes really important. And so you get barristers that are kind of desperately sending scraps of writing to presses, hoping to kind of make ends meet, either because they can't secure work or they're not securing enough of it. And that's kind of also why you have that connection to various kind of cultural products and types of writing in the mid-century.
We've got a question from Caroline that says, Eva's question and Ren, your comments on reform make me wonder whether there was a self-conscious reworking as the ecclesiastical courts were under the microscope. I don't know what the overlap was between barristers at each type of court.
So, sorry, I'm going to see if I can find that, or maybe Caroline, just ask you to clarify.
Yeah,
when you
I can, and the latter part, not knowing the overlap, it was something that's been answered. Sounds like there's not the professional overlap in terms of the personnel, but in terms of the ecclesiastical for the first half of the 19th century, about their authority and whether it's antiquated is very much under the microscope in Parliament, not ended until the 1850s. So I just wonder whether some of the, whether there's a reworking in there from barristers thinking about, again, sort of more the prominence and the increasing scope in that way of the civil law.
I think there might be something to that, and that also raises a point that I hadn't made until now, but that it's one of the curiosities of these the institutions that I'm looking at is that in this period where you don't see a lot of reform of the Inns of Court, you see tremendous reform of law itself and the law courts, right? The building of new courts, the dissolution of the ecclesiastical courts in favor of like civil types of civil law. And so barristers are obviously like very aware of and to some degree involved in these reforms. And that may be why, as institutions, the Inns are kind of thinking a step ahead of how to preclude the authority of the societies from being eroded. But some of these same people are also not necessarily opposed to the reforms in law that are taking place either, which comes back to these earlier, like when Sam and I were talking about different kinds of like liberalism and conservatism in operation. These are change resistant societies, but they're also change resistant societies that for the first half of my project actually are largely populated by like political liberals, capital L. So that's kind of another confounding factor in all of this.
And if you don't mind, I would like to ask a question. Only because I'm also sort of always curious about how people get to where they're going. And I wanted to ask about your next project and if there was a link, like, was there something about this research that you were doing that led you to there? Is this also sort of space that led you to the theaters, or how you got to the next project?
So the next project in some ways, right, does seem very disconnected, looking at amateur theater and much more so in the 20th century than the 19th. But that interest, yeah, in gender, place, power comes through. I actually got to the project initially from reading James Hinton's Nine Wartime Lives. So not necessarily directly from where I was looking in terms of my own research, but in terms of interest in institutions and the way they're organized, in the ways that culture is transmitted, in the ways that there are kind of micro power dynamics and then kind of macro dynamics as well. All of those thematic interests come through from one project to another, and certainly the grounding in place. I'm still kind of deciding case studies for this new project, but for example, one will definitely be about the Jewish Institute players in Glasgow, and that's going to be very much tied to what does it mean to be a Jewish person living in the Gorbals in Glasgow in Scotland. What does it mean in the particular time of the creation of the state of Israel, for example? So that kind of interest in rootedness in the environment will also carry through.
Excellent, thank you. So we have one more question about Sedgwick, I think, in the chat. If you want to go ahead and clarify, we have time. We'll make this the last question.
Thanks. I'll keep it super short. Hey Ren, nice to see you. I didn't quite catch the beginning of the talk, but so I just wanted to know how much your argument about homosociality kind of reinforces or moves beyond Sedgwick's argument. So both in terms of the chronology of that argument, but also in terms of the conceptual point about it being a continuum of homosociality and homosexuality until a kind of intensified homophobia in the late 19th century. So how do you kind of fit in with that?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I would say that I'm using Sedgwick fairly loosely, right, in that sense of the continuum, but because I don't necessarily have evidence of homosexuality one way or the other, I can't really make an argument about change over time and upholding or confounding Sedgwick in that regard. I talk about ways in which why there might be less why in the later portion of the century there might not be that intensification of policing and things like that in the Inns of Court, in part because their residential population is declining. And so at the moment you see the intensification of policing of homosexuality, you see a smaller population in the inns that would potentially be engaged in that activity. But that's kind of not necessarily directly engaging Sedgwick in an argumentative fashion, but it's just because I don't really have evidence that would allow me to do so.
All right, thanks so much. So I want to start by thanking everyone for joining us, and also for, this has been a wonderful discussion, and even there's been a whole bunch of side discussion going on in the chat. So it seems like everyone's interested in this. And so I hope that everyone will join me in thanking Ren and Sam for joining us today. And hopefully we'll continue to see you all at some of our other events. So thank you.
Yeah, and thank you all for attending during lunchtime or in your evening. I really appreciate it.